The raid, to be honest with you, really didn't accomplish much, but it did cause a great deal of consternation amongst the British ports and coastal communities, leading some 30 Marines divided amongst two boats. Captain Jones commanded one boat, as you see on the right, and Marine Second Lieutenant Samuel Wallingford the other, with the mission of burning the ships in the harbor, capturing the fort, spiking the guns, and sacking the town. In my research, I found that legend has it that the first building they came down, they turned out, was a tavern. And for some strange reason, the raid mysteriously ended on a very happy note. Now, this was a major revelation to me. This painting recreates John Adams' review of Captain John Paul Jones, Marine. After dining with the captain and several others at a very stylish French restaurant in the French port of Lorient on May 13, 79. In truth, the men were part of an Irish contingent of the French Army, of the Welsh Sergeant Regiment, who had volunteered for service as American Marines on board the Bohol Shard. This Irish brigade of some renown had previously served the French monarchy for the previous century. Now, as depicted, as you can see in the painting, both John Adams and John Paul Jones were led by Captain McCarthy during the review. Much to the chagrin of John Adams, serving as the American Commissioner to France, he was surprised by the appearance of these Marines. Mr. Adams had served previously as a member of the original Marine Naval Committee and had drafted the initial Navy Marine uniform standards. However, the uniform of this contingent of Marines was a red coat with a yellow collar, blue cuff and lapels, with a white waistcoat and breeches. It is said that the reason for the uniform of this Irish brigade was to remind the British that they, the Jacobites, were the supporters of the legitimate monarchs of England, namely the Stuarts, and therefore had more of a right to wear these colors than those supporting King George III, the Elector of Hanover. After having spent a year on shore awaiting a new command that was repeatedly canceled or postponed due to the lack of congressional funds to purchase a suitable vessel, Captain Jones was finally rewarded with an old and slow East Indiaman French merchant ship that was to be converted into a man of war and renamed the Bohol Shard. As for the crew of the soon-to-be most famous ship in naval history, Captain Jones would write from his log, and I quote, "They were one of the worst crews ever found on a vessel. They were generally so mean that the only expedient I could find that allowed me to command them was to divide them into two parties and let one group of rogues guard the other." End of quote. But the right people you won in a fight. However, on the 23rd of September of 79, the Irish Marines got their chance to confront their ancient enemies on the high seas and prove their mettle. There, off the English coast near Flamborough Head, Jones and the Bohol Shard engaged the English ships Serapis and Countess of Scarborough. In the middle of this epic battle, with the ships so close, it was possible to communicate between them. The English captain asked Jones if he was striking his colors, to which Jones replied in one of the most famous lines in American naval history, that "I have not yet begun to fight." The fight then increased in its intensity, with both ships lashed together in a death struggle, exchanging broadsides at point-blank range. The fight continued for 4 hours, with both ships suffering terribly, and both decks awash with blood. Finally, a grenade thrown by one of Jones' Irish Marines exploded in the ammunition magazine on the Serapis, setting the gun deck on fire. Still lashed together, it was then that the British surrendered to Jones. Although the British had capitulated, Jones' ship was in even worse condition and thus was forced to transfer its command to the Serapis. The Bohom Richard would soon sink beneath the waves, with Jones and his motley but victorious crew sailing their captured prize to Holland. The Countess of Scarborough would also be captured by the other ships in Jones' naval squadron and would also sail into captivity with the Serapis. Although a memorable victory for John Paul Jones in forever ensuring him a revered place in the annals of American naval history, yet not so well known is the story of the contribution of those Irish Marines, which contributed so much to further the cause for American independence. However, I found not everyone had forgotten their contributions, for on April 19, 1994, a joint resolution of Congress passed designating May 13, 1994 as Irish Brigade Marines Day, authorizing the President of the United States to issue a proclamation calling upon the people of the United States to observe such day with the appropriate ceremonies and activities. And I imagine a lot of drinking. In the spring of '79, the British had established a strong outpost on the tip of the Bagaduce Peninsula in Penobscot Bay of Maine, which they would name Fort George. In this last amphibious assault conducted by the Marines into the war with Mexico, Captain John Welsh, with over 200 Continental State Marines and militia, landed and advanced up a 100-foot steep, heavily forested rocky bluff, one shrub or branch at a time, enabling them to oust units of 2 British Highland regiments, gaining them a firm foothold, guarding the western approaches of the peninsula, at a cost of 40 killed, inclusive of Marine Captain John Welsh and 20 wounded. The Marine landing and assault on Bagaduce on Penobscot Bay was a tactical military success, but subsequent events and decisions turned success into failure. After several subsequent skirmishes, a British relief squadron arrived. The American naval flotilla retired up a one-way river with the British in hot pursuit and were forced to breach their craft and burn them to their keels. The Americans, with the Marines included, were then forced to return to the wilderness of Maine, eluding both the British and their Indian allies. In addition to serving on-board Continental and state vessels, American Marines served on the thousands of privateers that were issued letters of marque and reprisal and or private ships of war, which from the very beginning of the war roamed the seas in search of easy prey. These privateers at times were the sole reliance of the 13 states in disrupting the supply system and lines of communication of the enemy, bringing millions of dollars of essential stores and war material to the rebel land forces, and capturing and or destroying British warships, merchantmen, and privateers. It is estimated that approximately 3,000 privately owned armed vessels roamed the ocean and were crewed by nearly 100,000 men, inclusive of thousands of Marines. A review of the various ship's logs that I've taken a look at reveal that a myriad of professions could be found on board these vessels, as physicians, lawyers, army officers, politicians, merchants, and yes, even some ministers of the gospel were found serving as Marines. Marines on board these privateers visited the West Indies, England, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, France, and other places around the world. In return, they received ample pay, shared in the prize money from their captured prey, and were pensioned by the federal government after the war. This illustration on the right depicts one of the many actions by state and privateer Marines. In this case, Virginia State Marines provided the gun crews and marksmen for the armed galley here entitled the Miami, which cruised the upper Ohio River to help keep the aggressive Shawnee Indians under control during the summer of '82. As you can see here, the Miami had a 73-foot keel, carried 46 oars, and mounted 6 cannons, and ironically had movable 4-foot-high gun walls to protect the crew from both arrows and a makeshift or musket rifle balls. Look closely. In this illustration, the captain of the company of Virginia State Marines is informing the Indians to return to shore, while an eager Marine covers the canoes with a carronade next to the sergeant, smoking his pipe, which, if needed, could also ignite the fuse. This summer patrol of the Ohio, Miami rivers, and Lincoln Creek did much to discourage any depredations along the Shawnee territory, causing alarm among the tribes and concern for their own defense. After a long, circuitous cruise from France, the Continental ship Alliance, under the command of Captain John Barry, put into Providence, Rhode Island in late March of '83. Finally, on April Fool's Day, April of 1783, 33 of the last Continental Marines on duty were mustered out and paid off like their sailor comrades from the last surviving frigate of the Continental Navy. The vessel was then converted into a cargo ship, which went aground and was subsequently abandoned, leaving the infantile United States without either a Navy or Marine Corps until Congress passed an act for establishing and organizing a Marine Corps 10 years later. Records indicate that approximately 131 officers held Continental Marine commissions issued by Congress. The number of enlisted and NCOs is not exact, but probably does not exceed 2,000. A review of the ship's logs, muster and payrolls, reveals that as many as 13 African Americans might have served as enlisted Marines, 3 in the Continental Marines, and 10 others having served on board ships of the Connecticut, Massachusetts, and or Pennsylvania state navies. These 11X, it is reported, were paid the same pay and allowances while expecting to perform the same arduous duties. Throughout the 8 years of war, the Continental Marines suffered 49 killed and 70 wounded in action. In comparison with the Continental Army and Navy, the Corps of Marines was relatively small, but they too also contributed in helping to achieve our independence. As will always be the case, this class I dedicate to all those, past, present, and future, who have stood on what another naval officer, who was awarded the Purple Heart and Navy Marine Corps Medal in World War II, and would become President of the United States by the name of Lieutenant John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who stand sentry duty on the watchtowers around the world, so you and I can enjoy doing things like this.
Take 7 minutes.